morning we're just midway through the book itself. Section 9 is really kind of right in the middle, and so this is our 6th class. And what we find here is Schaeffer begins to kind of elaborate on what it means to practice this final apologetic. The final apologetic in itself is, of course, the direct relationship that the people who are watching us, non-Christians who are watching the church, have to the command of Christ. It's in the sense that if the non-Christian is observing us and watching us, that they should see a visible love. And so Schaeffer here takes time again to emphasize the true oneness, and is the goal of really of Jesus' teaching in John 13 and 17, a true oneness, a visible oneness. And the quote that we have from him here is the Christian really has a double task. He has to practice both God's holiness and God's love. The Christian is to exhibit that God exists as the infinite personal God, and then he is to exhibit simultaneously God's character of holiness and love. Not his love without holiness, that is only compromise. As Schaeffer said in a lecture on this at one point, truth without love is ugly, and love without truth is compromise. That sums up this book, and as far as the concept he's trying to convey. Yet there's something more here. I think that if you just kind of read over this very quickly, you might have missed something very deep that Schaeffer's trying to convey. And it's part of the core apologetic that he used. Truth and love itself to him is a part of Christian practice, right? Yet it's not just the true spirituality aspect and living it out in a practical sense, but it's also a living apologetic in itself. So, in case you missed it, Schaeffer mentions a subtle means of true oneness as opposed to a mere organizational oneness. So let's look at this. Specifically, the Christian is to exhibit that God exists as the infinite personal God. Okay? That's what he said in that last section. So the Christian is to exhibit that God exists as the infinite personal God. And then the second part, he is to exhibit simultaneously God's character of holiness and love. Now, I want to kind of stop and break this down because I think it's very deep. It's a lot of times we don't get the proper teaching that properly relates theology to the Christian practice, in the sense that it connects it together with the spirituality that we must practice, but also the way it exhibits the testimony of this final apologetic. The presentation of the gospel it's a means of demonstration. And so note that the failure, first of all, to understand God as infinite and personal is one of the greatest errors made by men in their understanding of religion. You look around at any of the religions of the world, and this concept is constantly messed up. The concept is combined in one entity as truly unique to the Christian God. So when you look around at these religions, generally you see those who make gods that are finite or gods that are impersonal. And likewise, the secondary criteria, of course, is that gods are untruthful or deceitful. Just think of the Greek gods, who lack any degree of personal love. It's usually on this kind of self-interest type love. It's not personal toward the person they're addressing. And yet further, you see gods depicted with this love, but without really any standard of love. Maybe they might love all beings, but there's really no personal aspect to that. And so this is unique in the Christian God. And so what I want to do, I wrote this up on the board, and this kind of helps illustrate a bit of what I see that Schaeffer's trying to say here. Because on this side, you have sort of his core understanding of the upper story and lower story. He makes this division to help us understand that spirituality is really encompassed in this whole thing, but the way thought is often presented, it pertains to an upper and lower story. lower story, and that we might talk about the natural man, or naturalism, if you're talking directly to the non-Christian viewpoint. But supernatural is something kind of in that upper story, pertaining to God, pertaining to the ultimate things. Now, in the person of God, you have this picture of this infinite God, who is infinite, and the theological term there is transcendence. Yet he's also personal, which is a concept that he is immanent as well. Religions of the world tend to mess this up. You'll have this very transcendent God that is completely other, completely infinite but disconnected from the real world. Yet he's completely unpersonal. Can you guys see let me make sure, let me lower that just for a second here so you can see the lower part. So you have a God that is completely disconnected from reality. I think you could, if you just thought about it for a few minutes, some of the New Age gods, some of the ideas of transcendentalism, you just survey a couple of them, and you'll find out they're having an error here or here. And the personal aspect, usually, you can target these right away, because there's really no relationship to the human being other than some sort of really abstract notion. Think about it like, I always think of the nature religions. You have like these, animals that are made into some sort of spiritual sense of themselves. You look to the hawk or look to this or that being or entity, and they're made transcendent, and yet they lack this real eminence and connection to a personal reality that gives you some sort of sense of knowing anything. And a lot of these religions really lack content. And for Schaeffer, what he's trying to get at is that when we talk about revelation, God has revealed truth and he's revealed love. Truth in the person of Christ and the gospel, but yet love in the sense of that his willingness to sacrifice himself on our behalf. So those things give us some sort of sense of God's nature, and yet they contain content that is real. And so when we look at what Schaeffer just said, the Christian is to exhibit that God exists as the infinite personal God. This is something, this character of God is something that none of the other religions can really make sense of, and especially with naturalism. Naturalism basically says there's nothing up there. We were listening to a lecture on Karl Barth, and Barth's whole teaching kind of does this kind of abstract notion of dialectics, and where he separates one thought over here and then puts this other thought over here and says, I believe this and I believe this, even though they're completely contradictory terms. And so what happens with that is that there becomes this lack of real truth content, because I've mixed the complete opposites. I've completely lost any form of antithesis, meaning right or wrong, and I just blend it all together. And then it takes them into this upper story leap of some kind of supernatural abstract concept that's really transcendent. It's completely other. It's not connected with reality. But God is both completely other, he's distinct from reality, yet he is also personal. And so when we demonstrate that, we unpack something that's very real. Both on the horizontal level, as far as antithesis, we can communicate back and forth with real answers of right and wrong that have meaning, and yet on the upper story level, we have this, or vertical level, we have a real understanding that those things that are real have been communicated to us supernaturally so that we can understand them in a substantial way. Now, this is where it begins to become so valuable, because when you begin to put this whole notion together, it's like, yeah, I now have some tools. I can come into contact with any person in any setting of religious background, and I can immediately target what's wrong based off who God is. All I have to do is just basically talk to them about, is your God personal? Is your God infinite? Does your God have infinite answers and personal? Those are things that only Christianity has in a truest sense. And I asked this question too of one of the people we sat in, one of the guys that was teaching on the Imago Dei in world religions. Now, of course, there is no Imago Dei in world religions, but their conception of who man is and who God is, because we're created in the image of God, it's completely lost, and it's obscured in all these weird ways. And so at the end of that, I had to ask, I said, so is it safe to say that Christianity has the only true sense of these things? And he totally agreed. He was like, yeah, we're the only one that has a true base of understanding of personality, both because God is personal, and yet he's made us personal so that we can relate to him, and he's made us in a reality that we can make sense of. A lot of the transcendentalists want to completely escape reality. Basically, we'll tell you, like some of the forms of Buddhism in particular, the mind is the problem, and so you need to go out of your mind, and then you need to completely escape reality. And then once you do that, then you will come to some understanding of truth. This is where we need to grasp the overall concept so that we can really, truly address those problems that are just prevalent in the world today. And so theologically, there are two terms that highlight this. So we just talked about transcendence and immanence. God is both. He both transcends the natural universe. It means he's holy. He's distinctly other, not wholly other. That's Karl Barth's distinction. And yet he is immanent. He's very near, he's close, and he holds it together. And so the thing to realize here is that this understanding touches our very existence and relationship with one another when we realize this practically. Because when we begin to see that God really gives us substance to truth and substance to love, then there's no artificial face on our love toward each other. It has a real truth content that backs it up. There's a basis of truth behind it that allows us to convey it properly. And so when we truly embrace this, I think that we can also realize that there's nothing outside of the care of God that in our personal relationships that he cannot touch. If we truly embrace that God is infinite in power, then we know that he can touch even the most remote thing in our lives that feels like it's an obstacle. And so if we took a serious look at his personal nature, that he's in our midst, we could consider every word and conversation connected to the sacred. And that's why Schaeffer came up with this idea that there are no little people. No little people, no little places was one of his sermons. Because every one of you matter. Every one of you count. None of you are lost in the scope of time. God has a very personal role that he wants to play in your life, in your time, in your space that you've been allotted in the universe. I mean, he wants to make a very specific impact there, and so everything becomes sacred, and we view that through those lenses. And this was really the view of the Reformers. You may remember the phrase coram Deo. It's like living before the face of God. Living right there because he's present, we acknowledge he's here, and so we're going to stay right there with that. And that's what's interesting with Schaeffer too, is a lot of times he's taking some of these Reformed principles and converting them into a language that the modern man can understand. If you just walked around talking about coram Deo, they may not understand the context. Even if you say it in a very Reformed manner, you may not understand that. But whenever he says it in this way, that God is really right here, the God who is there, I think it makes much more sense to modern man. And we should always be careful that we don't get stuck and tied to phrases that may hinder the gospel. Sometimes we may have to borrow something in order to help someone understand. Obviously, we have a wonderful tradition, so we shouldn't forsake that either. But it's all about helping this process as much as we personally, physically are possible of doing, as far as communicating it to others. And then secondly, practicing holiness and love then comes to this natural extension. If God is personal and present as well as infinite in his character and his holiness, then love for me is real and everlasting. And so then I have nothing to fear of the world's cares. Now finally I'm free to love in truth without reservation. And I think it's really liberating. It opens us up. And so it's a part of Christian practice, but it's also immediately connected to our apologetic to the watching world. And so, next thing I want to talk about is visible love. Schaeffer explains that there are two important facets to the visible love that he is speaking of. First, we have to say we're sorry. Okay, so we have to be willing to say that we're sorry. This is an aspect of visible love. And he says, what then does love mean? How can it be made visible? First, it means a very simple thing. It means that when I have made a mistake and when I have failed to love my Christian brother, I go to him and say, I'm sorry. That is first. It may seem like a letdown that the first thing we speak of should be so simple, but if you think it's easy, you have never tried to practice it. Now, you might be saying, well, apologizing is not enough. Don't worry, Schaeffer's going to get there. But before we get there, here again is a concept that's so simple, we may not really get it unless we unpack it. The failure to speak properly and seek forgiveness, but to divide and posture, is really the tragic story of Christian history. The church has regularly known these various controversies throughout history, and when people go and they look back at all these different problems that history has experienced in these areas, they hold that against us. Well, back in such and such a date, you guys had this problem. Such and such a date, you had this problem. Now, we know from a doctrinal perspective that sometimes that's been necessary, and sometimes there has been progress that has been made in the formulation of proper doctrine over the years because of these situations. So we can't completely divorce ourselves from that fact. Yet, we have to make sure that we understand that there were times, even though people were right, that they behaved in ugly manners. And so that's the difficulty. I want to quote a whole section of a couple of these next parts here. So, avoiding unloving attitudes and words. Okay, I have observed one thing among true Christians, and there are differences in many countries. What divides and severs true Christian groups and Christians, what leaves a bitterness that can last for 20, 30, or 40 years, or even 50 or 60 years in a son's memory, is not the issue of doctrine or belief which cause the differences in the first place. Invariably, it is a lack of love, and the bitter things we have said that have been said by true Christians in the midst of differences. These stick in the mind like glue, and after time passes and the differences between Christians or the groups appear less than they did, there are still those bitter things we said in the midst of what we thought was a good and sufficient objective discussion. It is these things, these unloving attitudes and words, that cause the stench that the world can smell in the Church of Jesus Christ among those who are really true Christians. I don't think he could say it more plainly, but he's really getting at this problem of attitudes, because the attitudes themselves sometimes can be more important than the substance of the arguments and differences. And granted, you could be fighting for something that is truly right. And Schaeffer's really talking about a lot of this period in history, specifically amongst the divisions that transpired because of modernism, because of the separation, and then the separation of the separators, and the difficulties that happened over that time in his life just became too much. He was overwhelmed by it and very disturbed by the lack of love that he saw, even in the midst of people that supposedly held truth. We must be mindful of the attitudes we carry and learn to take every thought captive in prayer to the obedience of Christ. Isn't it interesting that we can take even the slightest hint of truth and turn it into pride and arrogance? I think that's a constant thing for us. So in closing, I would like to read the last couple of paragraphs of this section, and then we can have discussion. He says, if when we feel we must disagree as true Christians, we could simply guard our tongues and speak in love, then in 5 or 10 years, the bitterness could be gone. Instead of that, we leave scars, a curse of generations, not just a curse in the church, but a curse in the world. Newspaper headings bear it In our Christian press, and it boils over into the secular press at times, Christians saying such bitter things about other Christians. The world looks, shrugs its shoulders, and turns away. It has not seen even the beginning of a living church in the midst of a dying culture. It has not seen the beginning of what Jesus indicates is the final apologetic, observable oneness among true Christians who are truly brothers in Christ. Our sharp tongues, the lack of love between us, not the necessary statement of the differences that may exist between true Christians, these are what properly trouble the world. How different this is from the straightforward and direct command of Jesus Christ to show an observable oneness which may be seen by a watching world.